Warm greetings, and thank you all so much for joining us in what promises to be, I think, a really enriching, interesting, and important talk and conversation. And a very warm welcome to our speaker, Professor Ellen Schrecker. To introduce Ellen very briefly, Professor Schrecker is an American historian who spent decades prolifically researching and writing about social movements, political repression, and higher education, including the politics of the academic community. She is retired from the faculty of Yeshiva University and has also taught at Harvard, from which she holds a Ph.D., as well as NYU and Princeton. She is a member of the National American Association of University Professors Committee A on Academic Freedom, and she was formerly an editor of its magazine, Academe. I realized I didn't say who I am. I'm Anna Haley. I'm a professor at the School of Social Work on the New Brunswick campus, and I'm chair of the New Brunswick Faculty Council. I want to share some words of welcome in absentia from Mary Beth Gassman, who's a faculty member at the Graduate School of Education and past chair of the New Brunswick Faculty Council. She sends her apologies not being able to be here tonight. She is traveling for work. She says, I'm delighted that Ellen is joining us. She is someone I have long admired. This is something that I have heard organizing this event every time I mention Ellen's name. From the time I was a graduate student in the 1990s, her work has shaped my own and is taught in classrooms across the nation, not only for its content, but its rigor and beauty of prose. That's from Mary Beth. Also, Mary Beth. Ellen is an inspiration due to her fierce bravery and astute commentary on the dismantling of academic freedom and free speech. She also understands the deep importance of shared governance. Thank you, Mary Beth, for those words. I have two more sets of notes that I want to share, and then we'll dig in. First, co-sponsors of this event, in addition to the New Brunswick Faculty Council, include the Rutgers AAUP-AFT Faculty Union, which has provided generously marketing assistance and technical support, and very importantly, tonight's moderator, AAUP President and Professor Todd Wolfson, who is on faculty at the School of Communication and Information at New Brunswick. Other sponsors of this event tonight are the Rutgers Adjunct Faculty Union, the Newark and Camden Faculty Councils, the Rutgers University Student Association, and Rutgers AAUP-AFTs and Rutgers Adjunct Faculty Union's Academic Freedom Committees, both. Okay, so finally, a little bit on structure and logistics. Dr. Schrecker will speak for roughly 45 minutes. When she concludes, Professor Wolfson will step in to moderate our Q&A. We have organized tonight in a webinar format style, meaning that the chat function can be used exclusively to send questions to host that then Todd will curate and pose to Dr. Schrecker later. The host to send questions to along the way are either Sherry or Danielle. As was indicated at the beginning, we are recording Professor Schrecker's presentation and we'll make it available on the Union and Council websites, but we will turn off the recording once the Q&A starts. We look forward to an informative talk and a respectful and open dialogue to follow. And at this point, just before we turn to Dr. Schrecker, Todd has some information on a breaking event affecting Rutgers and these issues that he is going to share with us.
Yeah, good evening. It's great to see you all. I'm really happy to be here and really excited to be in an event with Professor Schrecker. She's a hero of mine. But I also want to underline how important and timely this event on academic freedom is. Just today, the U.S. Senate Judiciary put out a statement that they're probing Rutgers University, and in particular, they're probing the funding of the Rutgers Center for Security, Race, and Rights, which is part of our law school. I think it's out of Newark. And in the press release, which I've just seen, they're saying that they are looking into claims of support from foreign governments, whatever that means. And then they have a series of quote evidence of anti-Semitism at the center, which is mostly statements from people speaking at the center talking about support for Palestinian rights. So it's deeply concerning. Our understanding is that a bunch of Republicans in the U.S. Senate have written to President Holloway pressing him on this issue, and the union, I'm sure the Senate and all of us faculty will stand up in absolute support of the leadership of the Center for Security, Race, and Rights. And so I think someone's put the press release from the judiciary in the chat. Thank you. That might have been Danielle, and also the information about the Center for Security, Race, and Rights. So please take a look at that. And it just underscores how important this is. It's a live issue on our campus, and we must stand up for academic freedom. So with that, I'm going to kick it to our special guest, Professor Schrecker. We're excited to have him.
Thank you, Todd and Anna and Mary Beth, for inviting me and for your kind remarks. As you may know, I've been studying higher education and political repression for nearly 50 years, with special attention to McCarthyism, which up until recently has been the longest lasting and most wide-ranging episode of political repression in, I guess, since the Civil War in American history. But we may be seeing worse. And certainly what Todd has just told us about is has terrible implications for what I'm going to be talking about today. We are under attack here in higher education, and it's very serious. And what happens with me, because of my past writing, is that whenever there's signs of political repression, especially with regard to academic freedom, I begin to get calls from journalists and academic colleagues and other kinds of activists asking me, well, how does this compare to McCarthyism? Now, I'm a trained scholar. I'm sensitive to matters of nuance and complexity, and so I usually answer, it depends on the historical context, as if I dare to use those words these days. But today, there's no more nuance. The current attack on academic freedom is worse, much, much worse in a number of ways. McCarthyism only attacked individual faculty members. They were mostly people on the left, formerly in or near the Communist Party, and refusing to cooperate with the Cold War witch hunt. But what we've been seeing over the past 3 years, and certainly we just saw today, is different. It does not attack individuals because of their past or present political activities, the way the McCarthy period did. McCarthyism never asked, for example, about people's teaching and research. But today, what we're seeing is a massive political attack on higher education that invades the classrooms and curricula and seeks to transform what students and faculty members can teach, learn, and conduct research on. And as I'm sort of talking about this, things are happening so quickly that I'm trying with, I don't know how successfully, to figure out exactly how the current crisis about the Middle East fits into that picture of an academic system under serious political attack. Because it seems to be a separate issue, but there are surprising connections between the main pressure groups involved. There's some overlap between the groups and the individuals involved, and there's similar ideological formulations and rhetorical strategies. And because, as I'm going to show, the American academic community is in a much more vulnerable situation than it was in the 1950s, which were seen as the quote-unquote golden age of the American university. The threat that's facing us is much more dangerous. If successful, the current campaign against the American system of higher education is going to destroy the ability of colleges and universities to provide their students with the intellectual tools to function as informed citizens within a multiracial and multicultural democratic society. Still, I don't want to present too bleak a picture. There is hope. Unlike during the McCarthy period, there are finally signs of an organized opposition on many campuses, as we see today. Whether it's going to succeed in preserving democratic higher education is unclear. But what is clear is that sitting back to wait for the forces of ignorance to disappear is not an option. So what I want to do today is to give you some historical background that could help us learn from past episodes of political repression, how we might better respond to the current right-wing attacks on the university. This probably won't be an uplifting narrative. Most of the time, whenever powerful outsiders sought to intervene in the operations of American colleges and universities, administrators and faculties caved in. We need to be clear about this. The behavior of the leaders of the academic community in the face of political repression was no different from that of any other mainstream institution within civil society. The media, the legal system, and private corporations all caved in. And there certainly was, as I entitled my book about McCarthyism and academic freedom, quote, no ivory tower. And I hate to say that today I see few signs of administrative courage at the moment. Now, higher education has always been under attack, usually from those who are upholding an inequitable status quo in the face of efforts to promote a more democratic and egalitarian society. By the late 19th century, when modern universities developed and new disciplines like the social sciences emerged, the academy became the main institution that harbors alternative ways of thinking about the world and offers a home to those who challenge the political, economic, and cultural orthodoxies that inhibit progressive change. But as many of these newly minted social scientists in the late 19th and early 20th century began to turn their gaze on the society around them, they became critical of what they saw. They were seeing the United States experiencing the most violent period of labor unrest in American history. But the main benefactors and trustees of the prestigious institutions where these innovative scholars worked were among the most powerful robber barons of the age. And they were not exactly happy with what those faculty members were writing and speaking about. So they pressed the administrations of those schools to crack down on their dissenting faculty members. People's jobs came under attack and a few heads rolled. In response, that earlier generation of professional academics learned to avoid advocating politically controversial issues. But at the same time, a group of eminent professors decided to take action to protect themselves and their peers from similar incidents in the future. In 1915, they established the American Association of University Professors, and they formulated the concept of academic freedom as a set of ideals and procedures, tenure and faculty governance in particular, that would ensure that faculty members could do their academic work without interference from outsiders who lacked the training and scholarly authority to pass judgment upon it. That concept caught on. Over the next few decades, hundreds of institutions bought into it, identifying the protection of academic freedom as part of their institution's mission. It was not always upheld, not even by the AAUP. For example, during World War I, when dozens of professors who questioned the war lost their jobs, the AAUP not only did not investigate their cases, but warned the professoriate to support the war, and if they were Germans or Austrians, not to discuss the conflict at all. During less tumultuous moments. Most of the individual violations of academic freedom involved what I call squeaky wheels, outspoken individuals who either clashed with their institution's administrators or else engaged in unpopular political activities, usually on the left. McCarthyism was the most serious challenge to academic freedom in the modern history of higher education. And I want to talk about how it operated and how it was similar or set some precedents for what is happening now. It began in the late 1940s and did not finally disappear until the early 1960s. Unlike the repressive measures of today, which seem to target almost anything an opportunistic right-wing Republican politician finds attractive, McCarthyism specifically focused on the supposed threat of domestic communism. Whatever its impact, its goal was to eliminate American communism and all the individual organizations, the individuals, the ideas that surrounded it from any position of influence within American society. And it was wildly successful. It chilled political activity on campus and caused many professors to censor their own teaching and research. Now, it's important to recognize that few of the individuals it targeted were innocent liberals. The professors who were attacked had some past or present relationship to American communism and were simply unwilling to cooperate with the Cold War Red Scare. Now, communism had always been unpopular, but it became central to American politics because of the tensions of the early Cold War, when, despite emerging victorious in World War II, when the United States and Soviet Union were allies, the American political elite felt challenged by the Soviet takeover in Eastern Europe, by the Chinese Revolution, and by the Soviet Union's development of nuclear weapons. And for groups and individuals that were already very hostile to anything relating to communism, the fact that the American Communist Party did have a Soviet connection, did and had been engaged in some espionage, we have to admit this, during World War II. Those connections made it possible for the right-wing politicians who were developing McCarthyism to attack communism as a threat to national security. Now, that was simply not true. The Communist Party was small, powerless, and despite its espionage during World War II, had been completely purged from the federal government and was essentially engaged in defending itself against McCarthyism, not planning a revolution. But those charges, just like the political repression today, were also being developed as a political tool by the Republican Party to attach the Democratic administration of Harry Truman as soft on communism. They used a false narrative of dangerous communist subversion that had just enough plausibility to gain support when it became clear that the Republicans' anti-New Deal agenda was not going to win them any elections. For some funny reason, voters like Social Security and unemployment insurance. Today, the Republican Party is similarly trying to divert attention from its real agenda of shrinking the government, ending the welfare state, rewarding the corporate sector, and empowering right-wing evangelical white nationalism. And it's doing this in part by disseminating a similarly false narrative about the repressive institutions of higher education, staffed by Marxist professors who are indoctrinating their students, and weak administrators who are capitulating to demanding and supposedly anti-Semitic students. Now, before the December 5th hearings of the House Committee on Education and the Workforce and today's Senate Judiciary summons, I used to think that McCarthyism's operations were sui generis, were unique. That's apparently no longer the case. What's happening today is an almost exact replay of a Cold War Red Scare with regard to universities. It's operating in the same two-step procedure of first identifying its targets, then using a demonized scenario to gain popular support for repressing them, and then finally applying sanctions to them. Now, the first stage is that of identification, and it's usually handled by the government. During the 50s, 40s, and 50s, it was the FBI was very important here. And of course, congressional committees were iconic. There was also an anti-communist network that, like the right-wing think tanks and individuals who are propelling so much of the current culture wars against higher education, that network played a major role in disseminating a demonized image of communism as a threat to American society. Now, during the second stage, that application of sanctions, American political repression was somewhat more lenient or less violent than in other systems, in other nations. Nonetheless, people who tangled with the witch hunt were punished with economic sanctions. They lost their jobs. And within the academic community, there were at least 100 faculty members who were fired or otherwise let go. There probably were more, but they tried to keep their cases secret in order to find other jobs. However, because most of the liberals and moderates who were running mainstream institutions like higher education tended to identify McCarthyism with a out-of-control senator from Wisconsin, they identified McCarthyism with McCarthy and insisted that they were opposing McCarthy and thus opposing McCarthyism, even as they collaborated with it. And they rationalized that collaboration by relying on a demonized definition of communists as Soviet puppets who lacked the freedom of thought necessary for an academic vocation. And there was no effective opposition to the firings and blacklistings that followed them. The AAUP, for a number of reasons, did not respond. But significantly, most faculties also accepted that Cold War consensus about the dangers of communism. And if they may have circulated a petition or two, they didn't really throw themselves into fire, into opposing what was going on. Even perhaps on the campus of Rutgers, which was the first university in the United States to fire a tenured professor for taking the Fifth Amendment before a congressional investigating committee. Now, the adherence to that demonization of American communism that was central to McCarthyism within higher education may distinguish it from what's going on today. significantly, as we shall see, even though many administrators and faculty members, as well as the broader public, have been buying into the culture war's demonization of the university, it's not as pervasive as this similarly false depiction that of communism that fueled McCarthyism, and that's important to see. McCarthyism did come to an end with the 1960s, not because there was opposition to it on the nation's campuses, I think, but because the witch hunters had run out of witches, and I think even more importantly, because the emergence of the civil rights movement forced the country to focus on real social and political problems rather than the imaginary danger of communist subversion. And by the early 1960s, political activities returned to the universities. There was the civil rights movement, the later Black Power movement, the anti-war movement in response to the Vietnam War, the women's movement at the end of the decade. All of these movements had their early roots in American colleges and universities. Student sit-ins in the South forced the United States to end legal segregation. Faculty teach-ins actually jump-started the anti-war movement after Lyndon Johnson escalated the conflict there in response in the in the spring of 1965. All those movements also transformed universities. They made the universities more internally democratic. There were new disciplines, new types of professors and students appearing on campuses. And the student movement in particular began to seek reform within their own institutions. They opposed their schools' collaboration with the war machine and demanded more access to it by people of color, women, and members of previously underrepresented groups on campus. Some of those protests became disruptive, especially as university leaders refused to respond to their students' demands and called in the police. That unprecedented amount of, what should we say, activism on campus provoked a significant political backlash. It was exacerbated, of course, by the media that focused usually on the most unruly and unkept students. And there were, of course, ambitious politicians joining the movement, taking advantage of the public's discomfort with that unprecedented campus unrest, and it was unprecedented. Politicians and others followed the example, for example, of the most successful of these ambitious opponents of the university, a former movie actor who ran for governor of California and succeeded wildly by attacking the student movement at the University of California in Berkeley, and his first official action as governor was to fire the university's president. Reagan had announced, by the way, that he was going to put down student protests, quote, at the point of a bayonet if necessary. There were also scores of laws being proposed, mainly targeting student protesters. Most were not passed, and those that were often not seriously enforced. But the most significant long-term impact of this backlash was that politicians and the public reduced their previously unquestioning support for higher education. They stopped that open spending for anything that a public university or college requested. Now, just as this backlash against higher education was gaining momentum in the early 70s, at the same time, the United States was experiencing the end of the post-World War II economic boom. The United States was facing challenges to its economic dominance, and although still number one in the world, had to contend with a serious inflation that occurred because of President Johnson's refusal to raise taxes to pay for the Vietnam War, and an oil crisis that occurred because of an earlier conflict over Palestine in the Middle East. There was also occurring deindustrialization as American corporations adjusted to new competition from other parts of the world by relocating manufacturing operations and shipping well-paid blue-collar unionized jobs to countries with cheaper labor. To many, it seemed clear that the Keynesian model of a social democratic welfare state that provided economic stability no longer worked. So the earlier sense of optimism about the ability of government after the New Deal to handle economic and social problems had pretty much disappeared. And it created an opportunity for a libertarian right-wing agenda of an unfettered free market capitalism to gain a hearing. As a result, combined with the conservative political backlash against the democratic movements of the 60s, the American political establishment moved to the right. It adopted a mean-spirited neoliberal economic regime that claimed to bring prosperity by starving and then privatizing the public sector. For the academic community, the combination of this backlash with the economic crisis of the 1950s, of the 1970s, sorry, brought austerity to the campus. As university administrators found themselves facing increasingly reduced public funding, what did they do? They mirrored the corporate practices that had brought about that austerity, and not only sidelined the faculty from making decisions about educational matters, let alone more serious political issues, but also fed into a vicious cycle of decreasing support, public support for higher education. The most serious of those actions that began to make universities unpopular was, of course, to raise tuitions. That created the current student loan crisis that I now think is somewhere around 1.7 billion, not billion, sorry, $1.7 trillion. But universities were also cutting costs. And they did this mainly through transforming the faculty into gig workers, into poorly paid part-time and temporary workers who now constitute about 75% of most instruction in higher education, who, unless they have a good union contract, tend to and work like no longer, I was going to say once upon a time, and taught at an elite university, lack the job security that tenure provides. They could be fired at any time for any reason or for no reason at all. and have absolutely no academic freedom. And for that reason, because we're now seeing such a miserably employed faculty throughout higher education, the quality of that education is declining. The universities are granting terrible working conditions to their non-tenure track faculty and not giving them the ability to provide students with the services that they need. This is especially the case, I'd like to note, at second-tier public institutions that are educating most American students. And that, like the CUNY colleges and the California state university system, were once promising near universal, low costs and accessible higher education to any applicants who were able to profit from it. That's gone now. But these changes happen slowly. And the academic community did not recognize the implications of the systemic changes that are occurring, and so didn't organize against them. The situation's complicated because at the same time as higher education is becoming more unpopular with the general public, it's also being seen as essential for individuals' economic success and social mobility. As the American elites were, and have been for a long time, dodging any serious attempt to deal with the social and economic problems facing the country, especially those that have been intensified by the increasing inegalitarianism of the neoliberal regime. The powers that be have been shifting much responsibility for making individuals' lives better to their universities. Now, the universities and colleges can't do that. That's not their job. But their failure to meet expectations for individual social mobility creates disillusionment and increases the growing hostility toward higher education. It's one of those vicious cycles. Now, it's likely that all the problems that I've been discussing might have led to a greater public questioning of the value of higher education in and of themselves. But they have been exacerbated because higher education is also being targeted by a powerful anti-democratic conspiracy to undermine the public sector that has been so brilliantly exposed by the Duke historian Nancy McLean in her powerful 2017 book, Democracy in Chains. This book is incredibly important. Democracy in Chains, The Deep History of the Radical Right's Stealth Plan for America. And that conspiracy, and it is a conspiracy, and McLean shows that it's a conspiracy, is the product of a highly self-conscious network of right-wing billionaires and free market ideologues, politicians, and political opportunists that poured hundreds of millions of dollars into the campaign to disseminate their negative image of higher education to the rest of society. And it's a right-wing network that is in many ways similar to the anti-communist network of the right-wing groups and individuals that fueled McCarthyism by creating the demonized boogeyman of American communism. But it's a network that's both much richer and much more ambitious. It seeks to transform American political culture. And it seeks to do this by discrediting and taking over the mainstream institutions of American society, not just the academy, but the legal system and media as well. And it's a network that recognizes the central role of universities today, not just because they're institutions that create some space for political dissent and an independent analysis of American society, but also because universities are the key source of expertise for policymakers. Just think about climate change, or think about the campaigns against COVID vaccination. They're quite powerful, and they've been at it, these campaigns, for nearly 50 years. They have been working successfully, I have to say, to delegitimize the academic community as the main institution that supplies that expertise, and that often is being attacked by the corporate sector just because the truth is not good for business. It's been enormously successful. And what has it been doing? It's been funding think tanks and organizations like the Heritage Society, like the American Legislative, what's it called? Educational, what is it called? Corporation or something. The Manhattan, it's known as ALEC. And the Manhattan Institute and Federalist Society that are offering right-wing policy proposals and training personnel to carry them out. These organizations are supporting litigation, they're crafting legislation, and they're disseminating right-wing propaganda to politicians, the media, and the public. On campuses, these reactionary billionaires have also funded academic programs and individual professors. They're grooming conservative college students to staff their network of right-wing organizations and support right-wing provocateurs that are creating disruptive incidents on college campuses that make universities look bad. And by the 1980s and 90s, some of you may recall that there was that this campaign against the university gave us the culture wars, with millions of dollars going to the likes of Dinesh D'Souza and Alan Bloom to convince the public that universities were actually dens of political correctness and reverse discrimination. By now, this campaign has been so successful that even many moderates and liberals claim to believe that faculties are out of touch with the rest of society and eager to silence conservative voices and repress free speech. That just was not happening. But it seems somehow plausible. Millions of dollars can do that. And that campaign intensified during the 2020 presidential campaign, when Donald Trump adopted a scenario created by the now infamous political operative Chris Ruffo that blamed critical race theory and similarly, quote unquote, divisive ideas for undermining American values and making students uncomfortable. Now, after Trump left the White House, and President Biden rolled back his executive order trying to get rid of this kind of educational activity within the federal government. The action moved to the states, where ambitious right-wing politicians like Ron DeSantis propose measures to restrict the ability of educators at every level to teach the truth about the past and present racism, sexism, and other forms of oppression that have blighted American history throughout this centuries. Since 2021, more than 300 of what the Civil Rights and Free Speech Organization, PEN America, has called educational gag orders, 300 of them have been proposed in state legislatures across the country. As of early November 1st, 40 such gag orders are now in place in 22 states. Initially, they targeted K through 12 education, but increasingly they're turning on higher education. And as at first they dealt mainly with racial issues, but now they're targeting on matters of gender and sexuality, TQ, and gender identification and transgender students. They're also targeting the structures of higher education that allow academic freedom to exist, tenure, accreditation bodies, and they're attacking, as one might expect, diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, DEI. And since October 7th, they are pushing new measures that are redefining anti-Semitism in ways that may punish critics of Israel. Florida, as we know, is ground zero for that kind of repression with its Stop Woke and Don't Say Gay laws on the books. And Ron DeSantis says direct destruction of its experimental four-year liberal arts new college. And now there's Palestine. For the past few decades, it's been the toxic third rail of academic freedom. And it's significant, in fact, that since 9/11, a disproportionate number of dismissals of faculty members, many of them squeaky wheels, with support for Palestinian freedom, have occurred. These people's troubles have often been fueled by a powerful and very well-funded Zionist lobby that has managed to create a pro-liberal consensus within mainstream politics. It's become increasingly active, especially on college campuses. After the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, the BDS movement, began to develop on American campuses. And for nearly the past decade or so, that Israeli lobby, among its other activities, its main activity, by the way, was funding politicians. That lobby has been weaponizing a definition of anti-Semitism created by a Zionist-affiliated organization called the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance that claimed created a definition of anti-Semitism that claimed that Israel was central to Jewish identity, and that therefore criticism of Israel was by definition a characteristic of anti-Semitism. As a result, after October 7th, the situation escalated enormously. The previous opposition to Palestinian pro-Palestinian activities and individuals on campus has just increased exponentially. So where are we today? There are now two major repressive forces focusing on higher education. The right-wing billionaires' network of think tanks, conservative political operatives, and opportunistic politicians, as well as at the present, the politically powerful pro-Israel lobby and its Christian nationalist allies that have weaponized charges of anti-Semitism to legitimize a crackdown on Israel, on criticism of Israel on American college campuses. And both are operating with very similar portrayals of university faculty members and students. And they're collaborating. The ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, that's funded by that network of right-wing billionaires, and that wrote so many of the so-called educational gag rules, is pushing state legislatures to pass resolutions supporting Israel and condemning anti-Semitism, newly defined. Meanwhile, what we're also seeing are these big donors like Mark Rowan at Penn, who are using rhetoric that's almost identical with that of right-wing politicians and think tanks, attacking things like critical race theory and divisive issues and clearly quote unquote family values. Already a few people are being fired, as we know. Already student protest groups are being dissolved, and already donors are beginning to pull back. And no surprise, already administrators are rushing to cave in, especially today after congressional committees are entering the picture. Yet, it may not be a replay of McCarthyism. It may be, in some ways, more like the 60s. Here I'm being optimistic, okay? Faculty members and students are becoming much more active and actually have more power than they know if they use it. But so far, they have yet to make much of an impact, and it's unclear what the outcome may be. It may be too late. And the prospect of a second Trump administration is utterly terrifying. I mean, I can see people beginning to look into real estate in Toronto. But, and except in a few cases, very few, where academics and civil libertarians have been able to prevent or at least modify the most drastic legislation, the academic community has completely failed to stop the educational gag rules in the red states. And the administrations, as we see, are caving in even everywhere. You know, a few months ago, we thought it wasn't going to happen in the Ivy Leagues. Those administrators are now apologizing for the non-existent past anti-Semitism on their campuses and forming task forces to deal with it. They are arbitrarily imposing restrictions on political activity on campus, and as during the height of McCarthyism, imposing sanctions on pro-Palestinian students and faculty members. Even so, the threat to academic freedom and the integrity of higher education over the past few years is in some way being countered by faculty members who had held back completely during the McCarthy period, who are beginning now to wake up, as are many students. And there are some promising signs. There was the immediate widespread response after the Middle Eastern conflict broke out, with student protests and faculty petitions that do not seem to be going away. And they even may be intensifying as administration's attempts to stifle those actions on their campuses are beginning to arouse the anger of civil libertarians and other concerned citizens. There's another promising sign is an unprecedented recent wave of unionization, political activity, and successful strikes by campus unions, especially among graduate students and contingent faculty members, and a heightened amount of activism by pre-existing groups. The AAUP, for example, which previously abstained largely from controversy, is now alert to the current dangers and releasing some very useful and powerful statements. As are individual AAUP chapters, like the one at the University of Pennsylvania. One might think of as at ground zero at the moment, which is beginning to form a coalition that is talking about a national day of organizing, a national day of protest sometime in April. There's a need for organizing at the campus level. We need teach-ins, demonstrations, and we need to create enough of a buzz on campus to prevent classic violations of academic freedom that blighted American higher education during the McCarthy years. Specifically, at the moment, we need collective action to create a movement on our campuses that exerts enough pressure on the administrations, these administrations that are behaving so cowardly. We need to press them not to enforce the educational gag rules if they're in red states, or to impose repressive measures against critics of Israel everywhere. The danger is great, but if we are to protect the integrity of American higher education and preserve the humane and democratic values that we cherish, we cannot stand aside. We have no other choice. Thank you.